right. We're going to be in the Minor Prophets again. Hopefully you have found the book of Habakkuk. It's a pretty small book, so it's not really easy to find. Called one of the minor prophets. We've been studying a lot of so-called minor prophets, not because they're of less significance than the major prophets, but just because they're shorter books. They're called the minor prophets. And this is one of the shorter books in the minor prophets, totaling 3 chapters. I love this book. This is one of those really unique books in the Bible. Just imagine being able to have a conversation with God about the events that are going on in our day. Imagine how interesting that might be. We sit here trying to figure this all out. What is happening? What is God doing? What is God planning? What is God going to do? And Habakkuk is doing the same thing as we read this book, and God responds to him, and they have a dialogue going back and forth in this book. This is essentially a conversation with God. That's what this whole book is, where God lays out an understanding of what He's doing and why He's doing it. Now, we've seen in the prophets a lot of information about God's working and God's plans and God's judgment against Judah and Israel. But Habakkuk is specifically against Judah right at the very end of the nation. So this is where we've been focusing in on the prophets to Israel, the prophets to Judah, to just kind of zone in on God's people. But this prophet is specifically to the people of Judah right before they are destroyed. And we're going to move forward. We're just going to get closer and closer to the day of destruction. I think Zephaniah is a little bit closer to the destruction maybe than Habakkuk. Maybe they're contemporaries about the same time. We're going to talk about Jeremiah as a whole, which will prepare us for our Bible class. And then we'll move on into Ezekiel and just learning about God's people being destroyed and God talking to them all the way through that to help us understand what all is going on in this time period. It's a really interesting time period to learn about God's interaction with His people as He judges them. At the beginning of this book, we find very little information about Habakkuk. We don't really know anything about who he is. It just says an oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. We don't know where he's from or any additional information about this man other than the fact that he is a prophet near the time of Judah's destruction. And we can kind of decipher that as we study the book. But what we learn about Habakkuk from the very beginning is that he is a man who is struggling with the ungodliness of his society. Everybody around him is ignoring God's laws and doing whatever is right in their own eyes. And in response to this, Habakkuk says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." Here at the very beginning of the book, Habakkuk lays out the current situation, and he complains, really, to God, wondering, why haven't you done anything yet? Why haven't you responded yet? Why haven't you set these people straight? Why haven't you come in to save your righteous from all those wicked that are around them? You know, it's not in your nature, God, to allow this wickedness to go on. You are righteous, you're good, and you're just, it seems, sitting idly by and letting us experience all kinds of violence and all kinds of suffering. In these statements from Habakkuk, you kind of get the picture that he thinks life is supposed to be pretty good on earth for those who are righteous. They're supposed to be blessed. That was part of Israel's promise. If you pursue righteousness and obey my laws, I will bless you. And if you pursue what is evil, I will curse you. And Habakkuk is wondering why he hasn't brought about the cursings on those who are evil and save those who are righteous, or turn the people around to do what's right. He can't understand why things aren't changing. The law is paralyzed and there's no justice in the land. What's amazing as we go into verse 5, that God responds to Habakkuk's complaint. And he doesn't respond harshly. He doesn't take offense at this or get upset with Habakkuk. But what he says is, I want you to look among all the nations and see. I want you to wonder and to be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if it was told you. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. He says, I'm going to show you something. Look out and watch at what's about to unfold in all the nations of the earth. I'm raising up the Chaldeans. Now, Chaldee is the region of the city of Babylon. Okay, so the Babylonians is what he's saying here. I'm raising up the Babylonians, and they're going to come in and they're going to take everything. They're just going to consume and seize all this property that's not theirs. In the absence of Assyria's power, Assyria was the major nation, they start to weaken. Now Babylon will come in, and as he goes through God's description of them, he says they're going to be, their horses are going to be swifter than leopards, and they're going to be like wolves. You imagine riding a leopard, riding a wolf to come in and to destroy a town. He says the horsemen are like eagles. Imagine them jumping off of their horses and flying in the air to kill and to slaughter. I mean, he pictures the Babylonians as this huge army that is evil and grotesque and that is dangerous and scary. Verses 10 and 11 says, at kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. He says they're just laughing at all the kings. They're laughing at all the fortresses because they know how to take them out. All these defenses are nothing to them, and they have all the battle plans to destroy. But notice at the end there he said they're guilty men whose own might is their God. God points out that this is not a righteous nation. God is bringing the Babylonians in to completely destroy, just like he said he would in Isaiah, just like he said he would in Amos, just like he said he would in Joel. He always says, I'm going to bring these Babylonians in to Judah and wipe them out. He's bringing them in, but he says they are guilty and they are idolatrous and they are boastful and proud, thinking that they are doing all this themselves. And apparently God doesn't have a problem with that. He's just stating it as it's a fact, and that he is the one behind their rise and their success. Well, Habakkuk doesn't really understand this. I can't imagine why. It doesn't seem to fix his problem. There's wicked, evil people in Judah. Do something about it, God. Well, I am. Watch. I'm going to bring the Babylonians who are worse, and they're going to come in and just completely destroy everybody. Whoa, wait a second, God. Habakkuk doesn't understand this. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One, verse 12? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors, and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Notice how he says, you are holy, you are righteous. You're not going to completely wipe us all out, are you? You're not going to allow the righteous to be put to death at the hands of the wicked, are you? He doesn't understand this. And then he says, verse 14, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no rulers. And then he starts pointing to the wicked. And he says, and Babylon specifically, he brings them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them with his drag net. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net. He makes offerings to his drag net. For by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his nets, mercilessly killing nations forever. He transitions into, you're making the nations like fish that are just scattered in the sea and like crawling things that have no ruler. And this nation, Babylon, is coming in with their hooks and with their nets, and they're just capturing everybody and pulling them in. And he's just wondering about all this. How can this be, God? How are you still holy, righteous, pure, and good as all this evil nation is coming in and finding all this success? It doesn't make sense to Habakkuk that God will defeat the injustice that's throughout the land, throughout all the nations of the earth, by bringing about the worst nation to destroy the rest of them. He even says in there, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You see, Habakkuk is looking at all this and he's saying, you didn't take the best nation, the closest nation to what you want it to be, and make them the most dominant and make them more righteous. No, you took the worst nation and you made them the most dominant. This doesn't make any sense. How can you do this? Well, then at verse 1 of chapter 2, he says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. He's made it very clear. I don't understand any of this that's going on. How can you do this? How are you still just and righteous in doing this? And he says, I'm just going to wait and see what you're going to say. And you get the picture. He's not being disrespectful toward God, but he's really wondering, how can this possibly be? And God gives him an answer. It says in verse 2, the Lord answered me. And his answer is not at first what we would expect. He just says, I want you to write this down on tablets and send it everywhere. The Babylonians will come like this and they will destroy everything. Just like I said, you write it down, make it clear to everybody, this will take place. If it doesn't seem like it's going to happen, he says, wait for it. It will surely come. That's his first statement to Habakkuk. Don't doubt. Whether this makes sense to you or not, don't doubt that this is going to happen because I promise it will. And then he says in verse 4, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. Notice these words that he speaks to Habakkuk. First of all, he tells him, you can write this down. It's definitely going to happen. And then he starts talking about somebody. He says, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. And then he says, but the righteous will live by his faith. And then he goes back and he says, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. This is one of the more confusing parts of this whole book. What does he mean? Why is he saying this? Well, if we start thinking about the meaning behind this, what we see is that there might be some pride, some arrogance in Israel and Judah, that they might think, it's slow. God hasn't judged us, so therefore he's not going to judge us. We're okay. We can keep living the way we want to live and doing what we want to do. Because it's taking some period of time for God to bring about the judgment of the Babylonians, people might get proud and arrogant and think, I can do whatever I want to do. And he says, but the righteous shall live by his faith. The righteous will trust that I am going to bring exactly what I say I'm going to bring, and they will act accordingly. And then he comes back again and says, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. He says, you don't go back to partying and enjoying your life. Now that this judgment has been proclaimed, you don't just think, well, God's not going to do it right now, so I might as well eat, drink, and be happy. No, you live by faith in what God has said and that it will be true. And this is God's commandment for his people. And then he transitions to start talking about Habakkuk's complaint in a little bit more detail. The latter part of verse 5, I think, is transitioning into Babylon. He says, his greed Notice how Habakkuk had said he's emptying his nets and mercilessly killing nations forever. He's this, talking about Babylon as being this greedy nation that's taking more and more. And he describes him, God then describes him this way: his greed is as wide as Sheol, like death he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. He points out Babylon is just consuming and consuming. This is what they're going to do. But then he says that everything's going to turn around after a certain point. This will not be forever. In the next section, extending from verse 6 all the way through verse 17, we see that Babylon will get what they deserve. So God's response to Habakkuk's confusion is, yeah, they're unjust. Yeah, they're evil. And they deserve punishment. And guess what? I'm going to give it to them as well. All the nations deserve punishment, and they're all going to get it at the hands of Babylon. But then I'm going to come in, and I'm going to punish Babylon as well for the sins that they have committed against my people and against me. And what he does here is he gives them 4 woes. Notice in verse 6, about halfway through, it says, woe to him. Verse 9, woe to him. Verse 12, woe to him. Verse 15, woe to him. And it's talking about, in each of those sections, the evil of Babylon and all that they do. They're constantly pursuing more. At the disposal of the nations. They're just stealing whatever they can steal. They're taking things that are not theirs. They're setting themselves up a false sense of security, thinking that their city is indestructible. They're just adding to it and making themselves appear stronger and stronger. They're murdering the innocent, and he says they're committing all kinds of sexual immorality, getting people drunk and exposing their nakedness and all kinds of evil things. So he points out that they will be destroyed because of this evil. Look at verse 13 of chapter 2. Notice what he says here. He says, behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. In the midst of this woe, he gives this woe, obviously going toward Babylon. He says, it's not from me that Babylon has pursued more and more and more and more. That they're greedy, that they have this lust for destruction and lust for temporary things that are just going to be destroyed one day. He says, it's not from me, but I am going to work in this destruction that Babylon is bringing and the destruction of Babylon to bring about a time when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. See how God has this vision of a future time in his mind that Habakkuk had no idea about. And he's sitting there asking these questions. How can you be just in all this? Habakkuk is worried about the glory of the Lord. What will the nations think as you're doing all these things and siding with such an evil nation as Babylon? God has something else in mind that is much more in the future and that is beyond the sight of Habakkuk. Well, as you read through those woes, one thing that's interesting is, as he tells us about the judgment of Babylon, the way he words it is really interesting. Look at verse 6. He says, shall not all these, and he's talking about the nations that Babylon is trying to gather and collect from verse 5. He says, shall not all these nations take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him and say, woe to him, woe to him, woe to him, woe to him. You know, all these woes that God is saying toward Babylon are part of a taunt from the nations that they have destroyed. So what's interesting about this is God is responding to Habakkuk. He's foretelling a time when all these nations that Babylon has destroyed will then turn it around on Babylon and destroy them. And that's the reason why the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. Because the nations will overpower Babylon, and then everybody will see the working of God in bringing about this great destruction. And the last woe is verses 18 and 19. And whenever you think about these two verses in the context of the fact that this is what the nations are saying to Babylon and to everyone about what has happened, it makes a lot of sense to understand that they've come to this enlightenment. Verse 18, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A metal image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple, verse 20. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So as you read through all of this and you start to understand the nations have this taunt, they're going to taunt Babylon for all the evil they've done, and Babylon's going to get what they deserve, and the earth is going to be filled with the glory of the Lord. At the end you see the nations recognizing all these idols we've trusted in did nothing to stop Babylon. And the only Lord is in his holy temple. Let's all keep silent in submission before him. So this is all God's response to Habakkuk, and he enlightens us about the taunt of the nations, that they will become submissive to the will of God as a result of all this, after that Babylon is destroyed. Now, the last chapter kind of wraps up this conversation with Habakkuk responding to what God has just revealed to him. Habakkuk is, in chapter 3, basically making the statement, I understand what you're saying, God, and I will choose to live by faith in the words that you have said and in the promises that you have made. He starts out in verse 2, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of years, revive it. In the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. You see how Habakkuk fears God as he remembers the work of God throughout history, and as he is now witnessing the work of God in this very generation as the destruction is happening in Jerusalem and Judah. And he fears the Lord and he respects him, but he asks, remember mercy. Remember your character. Remember who you are as you bring about all this wrath. In verses 3 all the way down through verse 15, Habakkuk describes God coming in judgment. And he uses a number of images. It's much like a psalm that we would read. In fact, some of the statements here sound a lot like Psalm 18 and Psalm 17 and a few other psalms. But his overall point is he's illustrating God coming in judgment, and he's illustrating it as this splendor. The thunder clouds roll in, and he's riding on his chariots. The mountains are shaking. The rivers are running in all kinds of different directions. Everything is being disturbed, and everything is submitting to God's descent as he destroys those who are wicked using the Babylonians. Verse 12, you marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Notice the picture of God has triumphed over his enemies, and he has saved his people. And Habakkuk is bringing all of this up, and in a prayer, in a praise to God, recognizing him for all he's done. The last words of Habakkuk are some of the best words in the book. As after he says this prayer, he just gives his overall response in very plain words. Verse 16, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. This judgment that's coming is terrifying. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines. The produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. So at the very end of the book, we see from Habakkuk that he is putting his trust fully in the Lord. Even though the enemy is here and the wicked are being destroyed all around him, even though there's no food anywhere, because that's what happens in a siege. The Babylonians steal all the livestock. They eat all the crops. And you don't get out and mow or do anything because then they'll capture you. Even though there's nothing anywhere, he says, I will wait for the day of trouble to come upon them. And he says, I will rejoice in the Lord and take joy in him being my strength, the one who gives me the ability to tread on high places and to remain safe. So hopefully the point of this book is evident as we've read through and just kind of summarized it and studied it together. God is making it very clear he is just and righteous even when he doesn't appear to be. He has the ability to use the bad for his own purposes and for good. He uses Babylon to accomplish his purpose of correcting the entire world and destroying all of the nations. And as we looked at this, you notice the theme or the desire of God is that Habakkuk would have faith in God's working, and that all those who are righteous would submit to God's will, even though it doesn't make sense. And if they'll do that, God will save them. He says the righteous will live by faith. The one who puts his trust in the Lord will live and survive this judgment. Habakkuk goes from crying at the beginning of this book to understanding what God is doing and how God is working, and then at the very end, rejoicing. He goes from crying about the immorality of the world around him to rejoicing in the strength and the glory of his God, who he trusts to work all things for the good for those who love him. We see at the very end here that Habakkuk has plenty of reason to be anxious about his life. I mean, we may have had some reason to be anxious about our lives in the last few months, but imagine this. There's no food. Period. It's all gone. The enemy has come in and taken every single bit of it. That's a reason to be pretty anxious. Yet we don't see that in Habakkuk at all. He has learned to fully trust in the Lord and to rely on him like the birds of the air who get their food that they need every single day. It's a pretty cool picture for us. And so if we're going to apply this, we have to develop the same kind of trust that God is calling for his people to have. To rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice, right? That's what Paul said. And to go to God in prayer and supplication. And he says, and Paul says in Philippians 4, the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will be given to you. This is what we're doing in our life struggles, our trials, our difficulties, is we're putting our trust in God and developing a greater faith. Notice Habakkuk does this, if we're trying to develop a greater faith. Habakkuk does this by going to the Lord in prayer, and then by going back in the Old Testament, going to the history of God and the work of God. He said, I've heard the report of you and your work. He's opened up his Bible and he started studying in order to develop a stronger faith. What does Paul say in Romans? Faith comes by hearing the word of God. And that's exactly what Habakkuk has sought after. So now, how does this all apply to us? Well, how do we put our trust in God in today's society? As we see evil all around us, are we putting our trust in God's promises to us and God's purposes for us? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. What is God's purpose for his church? And am I putting my trust in God enough that I'm living my life to fulfill that purpose? Am I transitioning from the nations who are worthy of judgment to the nations who now want to fill the earth with the glory of God and reject all the idols that we once went after to pursue God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength? I think that's the application of this book, that we would live our lives with faith, that if we will do the things that God has put us here on this earth to do, then God will be glorified through us, and that we will be saved at the end of this time of judgment. And so that's the message of the book of Habakkuk. Very interesting book. If you've ever wondered what God is working, what God is doing in your life, well, here's a guy who got God to converse with him, and he makes it very clear that God knows exactly what he's doing, and he brings all of this about in the New Testament. We actually see the quote from Habakkuk, "The righteous shall live by faith," 3 times in the New Testament: Romans 1, Galatians 3, and Hebrews chapter 10. And all 3 of those events are extremely important, critical sections of those books to help everybody understand that this is what God finds appealing. This is the criteria God uses to determine who he will save and who he will reject. And now we just must ask ourselves, am I truly living by faith? Or am I trusting in myself? And am I living for myself on this earth? Am I fulfilling the purpose God has given me in this life? Or am I coming up with my own purpose and worshiping my own idols and doing my own thing? If you're here this evening and you need to obey the gospel, or you need to ask for the prayers of the congregation here, we'd love to pray with you. If you're tuning in online and you have any needs, please let us know so that we can help you as well. If anybody has anything, please come as we stand and as we sing.